It's no secret that I like electric trains. It's also no secret that I like really nice scenery and walking through nice scenery and looking at electric trains running through nice scenery, which is why I really like Switzerland. In this video, I'm going to show you probably my favourite Swiss railway and, in fact, a pretty good contender for one of my favourite railways of all time. This, 16,397 kilometres from Flinders Street, is the Schynige Platte Bahn, which I'm mostly going to call the SPB because it's really hard to say with my accent. The SPB is an 800mm narrow gauge rack railway located just a few kilometres south of Interlaken in the Swiss Canton of Bern. The line runs for 7.2 kilometres from Wilderswil to the summit at Schynige Platte, gaining a little under 1.4 kilometres of elevation in the process. If you've been living under a rock or perhaps not near a mountain, rack railways allow trains to climb extremely steep gradients by having a toothed rail in between the running rails, which meshes with a cog on the train, giving it essentially unlimited adhesion. The SPB has gradients as steep as 1 in 4, that's 25%. For comparison, this is 1 in 30, the steepest mainline railway gradient we have here in Victoria. The trade-off with rack railways is that you can't go very fast, and the trip to the summit takes about 60 minutes, with the trains limited to 12 kilometres per hour, but honestly, you wouldn't want it to go any faster when the scenery is this good. The line opened in 1893 and was originally steam-operated before being electrified in 1914, and all 4 of the original electric locomotives are still in regular service today, 111 years later, a huge testament to the simplicity of electric traction. The SPB is a tourist railway, but not really in the same way we use that term in Australia. This isn't an old railway repurposed for tourists, it was always for tourists, and is still serving essentially the same purpose it was built for in the 1890s, today. Mountain tourism was already a big thing in Switzerland in the late 19th century, and a lot of railways and other infrastructure were built specifically for that purpose, in a way that was far less common in most of the rest of the world. In the second half of the 20th century, at a time when many Swiss Alpine railways were upgrading to more modern rolling stock, a decision was made to treat this line as a historic railway and continue using historic trains. But operationally, it remained a commercial tourist passenger railway. Unlike most railways in the area, the SPB is not open year-round. This is a summer-only operation running from June to October. The line is actually owned and operated by the Berner Oberland-Bahn, the meter gauge railway it connects with at Wilderswil. The Bob then connects to the main Swiss standard gauge network 3.5 kilometres away at Interlaken Ost. The line begins at Wilderswil, 584 metres above sea level, and the SPB has platforms alongside those of the Berner Oberland-Bahn. There's no track connection, of course, as this is a break of gauge. The SPB has their depot and workshops here immediately alongside the station, and part of the depot is open-sided, so you can get a decent look inside just standing on the platform. Departing the station, the line immediately crosses Bahnhofstrasse, Station Street, the only actively protected level crossing on the line, though I don't think it's actually a public crossing, there's an additional gate here. For the first 600 metres out of Wilderswil, the line climbs very gently, running up the valley alongside the Bob main line. Initially, the overhead wiring structures are shared, and both lines run on 1500 volts DC, the same voltage as Melbourne and Sydney's suburban networks. Both lines are powered by a dedicated railway-owned hydroelectric power station a bit further up the valley, so this is, and always has been, in the electric era at least, extremely low-impact carbon-neutral transport. Closer to the junction, the overhead becomes physically separate, with the SPB featuring lightly built single-wire overhead supported by wooden poles, and this is the predominant style of overhead used all the way to the summit. The 2 lines cross the Lütschine River on parallel bridges. Then the SPB curves away and sharply pitches into the 1 in 4 gradient. Some rack railways and funiculars use angled passenger cars with a floor shaped like stairs to maintain relatively level seating. Here's an example of that on the nearby Harderbahn. However, as this line also has some sections that are virtually flat, that's not really practical, and the compromise is that the seats which face downhill just have a bit more of a dip in them so you don't slide off. The line runs through open land with scattered houses for about 800 metres before plunging into a thick forest, which surrounds the railway for the next couple of kilometres. Not far into the forest, we come to a short crossing loop at a location named Rotenegg, which I assume sounds nicer in Swiss German than it does in English. And there's a lovely little building complete with flowering geraniums. A little further on, there's a very short tunnel passing under a rock outcrop, and the line continues through the forest with occasional glimpses down to the lakes in the valley below. After a second short tunnel, the line eventually climbs out of the shadows into open alpine pasture, with spectacular views back to Interlaken, Lake Brienz and Lake Thun, and the views just keep getting better from here. We then arrive at the line's only intermediate station, Breitloenen. which has a crossing loop and a quite substantial building with a shop in it. From my observations, not many passengers actually get off here, although there are lots of walking tracks from the station leading both up and down the mountain. We're now at 1,542 metres, having already climbed almost a kilometre vertically since Wilderswil, and we're not done yet. The next part of the line climbs steeply across the open hillside, with the village of Interlaken spread out down below. And while we're not quite at the most dramatic part of the line, I think this spot probably is the most iconic. Because each train is limited to 2 cars, when passenger demand is high, multiple trains run in convoy, following each other on line of sight, something that's quite common on rack railways. For me as a railway photographer, this spot was pretty much paradise. Wandering around on a Swiss hillside on a beautiful summer day, with multiple trains moving barely faster than walking pace, and plenty of time to move around and take multiple different angles of each train. Beyond here, the line gets steadily more rugged, clinging to the mountainside and passing several large rock formations. When the line is closed for winter, they actually dismantle the overhead wiring on this section so it doesn't get damaged in avalanches. Apparently the dismantling process can be done in a single day, and the same for putting it back up again. The Swiss don't muck around. The line then passes through a 150 metre long curved tunnel, and the scenery starts getting violently Swiss. When I described this landscape as alpine pasture earlier, I meant that very literally. The mountain is covered in cows, all wearing large cowbells. This contributes to the mountainside's very distinctive soundscape, which is an almost constant background of cowbells interspersed with the distinctive hum of the train's cogwheels meshing with the rack. The final section of the line climbs through a dramatic rock cutting, through another short tunnel, then finally levels off into Schynige Platte, the summit station at 1,967 metres above sea level. There are 2 tracks here for terminating trains with a crossover at the far end, and the views from here are fine. The majority of what you're seeing in this video was photographed on a stunning clear day in the summer of 2017, but the first time I came here was actually back in 2012 when the weather was a little bit more alpine. While we didn't exactly get the clear views on that trip, I was certainly able to capture some very authentic mountain conditions, and there were even a few patches of snow along the line, which, as an Australian, I found quite exciting, but most of the other passengers seemed fairly unimpressed. A short walk from the station is a restaurant, because all Swiss mountains need a restaurant, which of course receives all its supplies by train, as there's no other way of getting up here. And in typical rack railway style, goods vehicles are attached to the uphill end of regular passenger trains as required. Apart from the views, one of the main attractions up here is an alpine botanic garden, which was established in 1928 for research and conservation purposes, and displays around 800 species of native Swiss alpine plants, many of which would be naturally widespread in this area if it wasn't for these ladies. There are plenty of walking tracks leading away from the station, and it's a great start point for exploring the mountains on foot. On our 2017 visit, we chose to walk back down the hill to Breitloenen, which was absolutely stunning, and this was the view where we sat down for lunch. Alright, we need to talk about these trains. As is standard on most rack railways, the locomotives are always on the downhill end of the train, which reduces the risk of the passenger cars running away, although they do also have emergency rack brakes. The passenger cars look like they have driver's cabs, but it's actually more of a guard's compartment. I'm not sure what the local name for this role is, but in English we'd typically call them a guard or a conductor. So it's not a driver's cab, the driver is always in the locomotive at the downhill end of the train, and the guard simply keeps a lookout when running in the uphill direction. The only real control they have is this wheel, which I'm assuming is an emergency handbrake. It's connected by a mechanical linkage which runs underneath the cars, up the front of the locomotive and into the driver's cab, where it appears to connect with an electrical switch. I'm just speculating here because I couldn't find a clear answer, but I assume that cuts traction power to the locomotive when the guard's brake is applied. On the newer cars, the brake wheel has a cover creating a very distinctive nose. Most of the fleet are made up of this type of car, the bodies of which were built in the 90s and early 2000s. But they were actually built on the underframes of much older passenger cars. The design of these new cars was clearly heavily based on these ones, which at first glance look quite similar, but have slightly more elegant lines. These two actually date from 1898 and 1901, but were heavily rebuilt to their current appearance in the late 60s. Then there are these open cars dating from the line's earliest operations in the 1890s, and they're still used in normal service today, though only if the weather is nice. The first car in this set, number 3, dates from the line's opening in 1893, and it was obviously an enduring design, as car number 7 here was built much later in 1924. There's another pair with a similar age gap, cars 6 and 8, and another 2 of a similar design with closed sides, but I don't have any pictures of them. All up, there are 20 cars available for traffic, which allows 10 two-car trains to be made up, using nearly all of the 11 locomotives. Some of the modern cars are fitted with a pantograph, which is not actually for power collection, but for scraping ice off the overhead wire. I assume this is only done on the first train or two of the morning when conditions require it. I never saw one running with it raised. Every car has a guards compartment and is capable of leading up the hill, but I've only ever seen 2 car sets operating. I think single car running is pretty uncommon. The line also has various goods and works vehicles, including a snowplow and this friendly-looking water tanker. At least, I assume it's for water. I could be wrong. Please don't drink from it without seeking further clarification. When the line was steam operated, there were, I think, 5 steam locomotives on the roster. One of them, number 5, still exists today, although it was shut away in the shed on both of my visits. Number 5 only comes out for special occasions, roughly 4 times each season. But it also serves an essential role in the railway's operation, being used to propel the works train that dismantles and replaces the overhead wire on the upper slopes at each end of the running season. When the line was electrified in 1914, 4 of these adorable little electric locos were acquired for the service. They're described by the standardised Swiss classification system as HE2/2 locomotives, meaning a rack-equipped electric locomotive with 2 powered axles and 2 axles in total. Although that description isn't 100% accurate for these locos because the cogwheels aren't actually on the axles, they're in the middle and provide all of the tractive effort, with the actual wheels unpowered, so these locomotives would not be able to move on a track without a rack. Several more of this type of locomotive were also acquired by the nearby Schynige Bahn about 10 kilometres further up the valley, which happened to be the same gauge and voltage as the SPB and also opened in 1893, just 1 week after the SPB. It became standard practice to transfer locos between the 2 railways as demand required. While Schynige Platte only operated in summer, the Schynige Bahn's busiest time was in winter, so this was a very convenient arrangement. Eventually, as the Schynige Bahn modernised its fleet, many of these little locos were transferred to the SPB permanently. And today, the line is operated by the original 4 locos from 1914, plus 7 more imported from up the valley. While Schynige no longer uses this type in mainline service, they do still have at least 3 more still on site at their depot at Lauterbrunnen, where they're used for shunting. Something that's very unusual about the way trains operate on this line, and well done if you already spotted this, is that the locomotives almost always run with the pantograph lowered on the downhill run, even on the relatively flat-looking bit into Wilderswil. Obviously, the gradient is enough to make the whole downhill trip by gravity, and running with the panto lowered would save on wear and tear. They must have a small onboard battery as the headlights still work without the overhead power. In the driver's cab, the master controller is on a slight angle to compensate for the steep gradient on which these trains spend most of their running time, and the drivers have a small sloped plate to stand on. As you've no doubt noticed, the fleet today is extremely colourful, with several different colour schemes representing different eras in the railway's history. Of the original 4 SPB locomotives, which carry the numbers 11 to 14, number 12 is in this attractive green livery with black and pale yellow lining, and this is how the locomotives were painted when brand new. It's very fitting that number 12 gets to carry this look, as it was the first electric loco to operate on the line during testing in 1913. Apparently the green didn't last very long, and today number 11 represents the next period in history, wearing plain black, which I must say I think looks very smart. It's not just the colours that are backdated on these locos, various other features are also representative of the era, such as these large headlamps and this funny shaped horn. I don't know if I'm overthinking this, but the shape looks very similar to a traditional Swiss Alp horn. Compare that to the next loco, number 13, which has small embedded headlights and no visible horn. It probably has one somewhere, but being Switzerland, you're very unlikely to ever actually hear it. Swiss trains get around with very little fuss. 13 is wearing a very bright fire engine red introduced in 1999. The final of the original 4, number 14, is painted dark brown, which became the standard Berner Oberland Bahn livery in the 50s and 60s, replacing the black. Of the 7 ex-Schynige locos, 4 of them arrived in the 60s and 70s and got new numbers, continuing the local series, numbers 16 to 20. A further 3 came over in the 80s and 90s and kept their original numbers of 61, 62 and 63. Today, number 16 is in the fire engine red, while 18 carries the dark brown. 19 and 20 both wear a red and cream livery, which has been worn by several members of the fleet since the 1970s, matching the passenger cars. And finally, the 360 series locos are still carrying the plain dark green of their original railway, and the locos still employed as shunters at Lauterbrunnen are also still that colour. I'd say the dark green is the only livery that looks a little bit dull, but honestly they all look pretty great. Feel free to argue about which one looks best down in the comments. I think my pick might actually be the brown. I think it looks really good. Most of the locomotives also have names, many of them the names of alpine flowers, and carry an accompanying coat of arms, which is quite common across all Swiss railways. So I hope you've enjoyed this video from Taitset Productions International Division. If you ever find yourself in Switzerland, be absolutely sure to check out this excellent little railway, and thank you very much for watching.